The dust from the south didn't look like a storm. It looked like the earth itself was rising up to swallow the horizon. In the spring of 717 AD, the citizens of Constantinople watched that dust from the top of the Theodosian walls, and they knew it was the end. For decades, the Ummayad Caliphate had been erasing the world they knew. They had taken the grain of Egypt, the holy sites of Jerusalem, and the proud cities of Persia. Now, they were coming for the golden apple. This wasn't a raid or a border dispute. It was an extermination. At the center of the panic was a man who shouldn't have been there. Theodosius III was a tax collector who had been forced onto the throne by a rebellious army. He was a placeholder, a weak man sitting in a palace of ghosts, waiting for the executioner to arrive. He knew he couldn't stop the 120,000 soldiers marching toward him. He knew he couldn't stop the 1,800 ships coming to choke the harbor. He was a man waiting to die in a city that had forgotten how to fight. But out in the mountains of Anatolia, a different kind of man was watching the same dust. His name was Conan, though history would call him Leo III. He didn't have a famous family tree or a golden cradle. He was a soldier from the frontier, a man who had spent his life in the mud and blood of the borderlands. He spoke Arabic fluently. He had dined with Arab generals and traded blows with their scouts. He didn't view the Caliphate as some supernatural force of destiny. He viewed them as a machine, and he knew how to throw a wrench into the gears. As the Arab commander Maslama Abdul Malik led his massive host through the heart of modern-day Turkey, he encountered Leo. To Maslama, Leo looked like a gift from God. Here was a talented, charismatic Byzantine general who seemed disgusted with the chaos in Constantinople. Leo didn't meet Maslama with a sword. He met him with a proposal. He told the Arab prince exactly what he wanted to hear. He claimed the empire was a sinking ship. He said the people in the capital were cowards who would open the gates for anyone who could bring stability. Leo played the part of the traitor with terrifying perfection. He told Maslama that if the Caliphate supported his bid for the throne, he would rule as a puppet. He would turn the greatest city in Christendom into a vassal state of the Caliph. To Maslama, this was the ultimate victory. Why lose 20,000 men charging the strongest walls in the world when you could simply walk through the front door? Maslama was a brilliant general, but he was blinded by his own ambition and the prophecy that a man with the name of a prophet, his brother Caliph Suleiman, would take the city. He saw Leo as a tool, a stepping stone to his family's eternal glory. The two men entered into a deadly dance of diplomacy. Leo convinced Maslama to slow his advance, to wait, and even to spare the lands and crops under Leo's personal control. Maslama agreed, believing he was protecting his own future tax base. It was a staggering strategic error. While Maslama waited and moved with caution, believing the city was already his, Leo was moving like a shadow. He used the breathing room to gather his own loyal troops, to stockpile grain, and to send secret messages to the desperate men inside Constantinople. By the time Leo reached the gates of the capital, he wasn't arriving as a conqueror for the Caliphate. He was arriving as the only man who could save the Romans from themselves. Theodosius III, sensing the shift in the wind, didn't fight. He saw the fire in Leo's eyes and the iron in his voice. The tax collector stepped down and vanished into a monastery, glad to be rid of the crown that felt like a noose. On March 25, 717, Leo III walked into the Hagia Sophia. The incense was thick, the priests were trembling, and the crown was placed on the head of a man who had spent the last few months lying to the most powerful army on earth. Outside the walls, Maslama was still waiting for his client king to deliver the keys. He moved his army across the Dardanelles and onto the European side, officially surrounding the city. He set up a massive camp, a city of tents that stretched as far as the eye could see. He looked at the triple-layered walls of Constantinople and smiled, thinking he wouldn't even need his siege engines. He expected the gates to swing open at any moment. He expected a messenger to come out and invite him to a banquet where Leo would bow before him. The messenger never came. Instead, the banners on the walls changed. The symbols of a fractured, dying empire were replaced by the personal standards of Leo III. The men on the battlements weren't looking for a deal. They were sharpening their spears. Maslama realized with a cold, sinking feeling in his gut that he hadn't found a traitor. He had found a wolf. The The loyal client was gone. In his place was an emperor who had used the Caliphate's own momentum to propel himself to the throne. Leo didn't just stop at closing the gates. He began a psychological campaign to break the morale of the besiegers before the first arrow was even shot. He used the grain he had tricked Maslama into sparing to feed the city. He stood on the walls and looked down at the Arab generals, mocking them. He had burned the bridges behind him. There was no more negotiation. There was no more diplomacy. On August 15th, 717, the full weight of the Ummayad war machine finally pressed against the city. The fleet, a forest of masts that blocked out the sun, began to move into the Bosphorus. The land army, tens of thousands of professional killers, began to dig their trenches and build their palisades. They were angry. They had been embarrassed by a mountain peasant, and they intended to make the city pay in blood. They thought the siege would last weeks. They thought the city would starve in a month. But as the first Arab ships tried to push into the narrow waters of the Golden Horn, they noticed something strange. The Byzantine ships weren't fleeing. They were waiting. And on the prows of those ships were strange copper tubes shaped like the heads of lions and dragons. Leo III stood on the seawall, watching the currents. He wasn't just a soldier or a liar. He was a man who understood that to save an empire, you had to be willing to set the world on fire. He gave the signal. The copper tubes hissed. The sky turned a sickening shade of orange. The air began to smell like chemicals and death. The great lie was over. The great fire was about to begin. The copper tubes didn't just spray fire. They exhaled a roar that sounded like 1,000 demons screaming at once. This was Greek fire, the most guarded state secret in the Roman world. And for the Arab sailors in the Bosphorus, it was the last thing they would ever see. As the liquid hit the water, it didn't go out. It spread. It floated. It clung to the wooden hulls of the Umayyad ships like a living, hungry organism. This wasn't a normal fire that you could douse with a bucket of seawater. In fact, the water seemed to make it burn hotter, turning the surface of the sea into a carpet of unquenchable flame. Imagine being trapped on a wooden ship, surrounded by thousands of tons of burning oil that follows you as you try to swim away. The Arab fleet, once a proud forest of masts that promised the end of Byzantium, was now a slaughterhouse. Ships collided with each other in a desperate attempt to escape the narrow straits, only to spread the fire from deck to deck. Men jumped into the water only to find the sea itself was on fire, their silk and wool clothing acting as wicks for the chemical nightmare. The stench was unbearable, a mix of sulfur, bitumen, and roasting flesh that drifted over the city walls, telling the citizens of Constantinople that their new emperor wasn't just a liar. He was a sorcerer of war. If you were a sailor on one of those ships and saw the sea itself start to burn, would you have jumped into the fire or stayed on the burning ship? Tell us in the comments what you would have done in that moment of pure terror. Leo III watched the carnage from the sea walls with a cold, detached satisfaction. He had broken the naval blockade in a single afternoon. The surviving Arab ships fled toward the southern coast, terrified to come within a mile of the Roman siphons. This meant the Golden Horn, the vital harbor of the city, remained open. While the land army of the Caliphate was massive, it was now disconnected from its supplies. Ships from the Black Sea could still sneak in grain and fish to feed the city. Leo had effectively turned the siege into a waiting game, and he knew something that the desert-born generals of the Caliphate didn't. The Roman winter was coming. By November, the Mediterranean sun had vanished, replaced by a sky the color of wet lead. The winter of 717 to 718 was not a normal winter. Historical records claim it was one of the most brutal in centuries, with snow covering the ground for over 100 days. For the Arab army, it was a death sentence. They had come prepared for a quick summer victory, dressed in light gear and camping in open trenches. Now, they were trapped in a frozen wasteland of mud and ice. The logistics of the Caliphate began to shatter. The supply lines stretching back to Syria were thousands of miles long and constantly harassed by Roman mountain guerrillas. Inside the Arab camp, the sounds of war were replaced by the sounds of coughing and the rhythmic thud of frozen bodies being piled into mass graves. Panic turned into a slow, grinding despair. When the grain ran out, the soldiers began to slaughter their transport animals. First, the camels, beasts of burden that couldn't survive the Roman frost. Then the horses, the pride of the Ummayad cavalry, were butchered and eaten just to keep the men's hearts beating for another day. We often think of medieval wars as all swords and shields. But do you think a general's greatest enemy is the opposing army or the weather? Pause the video and let me know your thoughts below. History is full of empires that were defeated by the cold. But the hunger didn't stop at the horses. As the snow deepened, the camp became a place of ghoulish horror. The soldiers, the elite warriors of a global empire, were reduced to boiling the leather from their own sandals and saddles to make a flavorless, rubbery broth. Chroniclers of the time, perhaps with some exaggeration but a core of truth, spoke of men resorting to the unthinkable, cannibalism. They were surrounded by walls they couldn't climb and a sea they couldn't cross, dying in the shadows of a city that was watching them starve. Inside Constantinople, the situation was grim but controlled. Leo III was a tyrant of efficiency. He had calculated exactly how much every man, woman, and child needed to survive. He moved through the streets not as a distant god, but as a military governor. He used his secret police to sniff out any talk of surrender. If a priest suggested that the Arab invasion was a punishment from God and that the city should open its gates, that priest disappeared. Leo knew that a siege is won in the mind before it is won on the battlefield. He kept the church bells ringing. He kept the markets open, even if the shelves were nearly bare. He gave the people a common enemy to hate, pointing from the walls to the freezing, dying men in the trenches below. Leo was also a master of disinformation. He sent spies into the Arab camp to spread rumors that a massive relief army from the west, the legendary Franks, was marching to slaughter the survivors. He wanted the Arab soldiers to feel like they were being hunted by ghosts in the snow. He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike, but he wasn't just waiting for the weather to kill them. He was waiting for a message from the north. Deep in the frozen forests of the Balkans, a different power was watching the siege. The Bulgars, a fierce warrior culture led by Khan Turgal, were the wild card of the 8th century. Leo had spent months in secret negotiations with them, promising gold, titles, and trade if they would fall upon the Arab rear. The Bulgars didn't care about Christianity or the Caliphate. They cared about plunder. And Leo had told them that the Arab camp was full of the riches of the East, now guarded by men too weak to hold their spears. As the spring of 718 finally arrived, the snow began to melt, revealing a landscape of thousands of unburied corpses around the walls of Constantinople. The Caliphate's army was a ghost of its former self, but they were still holding on, hoping for a new fleet from Egypt to save them. They didn't know that Leo had already mapped out their destruction. He had turned the sea into fire and the winter into a tomb. Now he was about to unleash the most terrifying cavalry force in the Roman arsenal. The siege has been going on for months, and both sides are at their breaking point. Who do you think will blink first? If you're enjoying this video about the battle that saved Europe, make sure to hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these hidden stories to life. The stage was set for the final act. The Arab army was starving. The Roman city was hardened, and in the distance, the sound of Bulgar war horns began to echo through the hills. Leo III stood on the highest tower of the walls, looking toward the mountains. The lie had worked. The fire had burned. Now it was time for the blood. Just as the Arab army was reaching its absolute breaking point, a glimmer of hope appeared on the southern horizon. Caliph Umar II, who had succeeded Suleiman, dispatched 2 relief fleets from Egypt and North Africa sailing toward Constantinople. These weren't just warships. They were floating warehouses carrying fresh troops, heavy siege equipment, and enough grain to feed Maslama's starving men for a year. If these ships linked up with the land army, the siege would be reborn. Leo's waiting game would be over, and the city would finally crumble. But Leo III was already 3 steps ahead. He knew that the sailors manning these new Egyptian ships weren't loyal subjects of the Caliphate. Most of them were Coptic Christians, men forced into service by their conquerors. They were sailors who prayed to the same God as the people inside Constantinople, and they were looking for any excuse to stop serving the men who had occupied their homeland. Under the cover of a moonless night, Leo sent his own agents out in small, silent, rowing boats. These weren't soldiers, they were spies and diplomats. They slipped through the Arab naval pickets and reached the Egyptian ships. Their message was simple: defect now, and you will be welcomed as brothers. Stay, and you will burn with the rest. The response was immediate and devastating for the Caliphate. Hundreds of Coptic sailors lowered themselves into the water or hijacked their own vessels, rowing toward the city walls under the shadow of darkness. They didn't just bring their muscles, they brought intelligence. They told Leo exactly where the supply ships were anchored, which ones were carrying the most dangerous cargo, and where the guards were weakest. Imagine being a Coptic sailor, knowing that if you're caught defecting, your family back in Egypt might pay the price. Would you have stayed a slave to the Caliphate or risked everything for freedom? Drop a risk or stay in the comments below. Leo didn't waste a second. Using the spy's information, he launched a lightning strike with his Greek fire ships. Because the Byzantines knew exactly where to hit, the attack was a surgical massacre. The new fleets, which were supposed to be the salvation of the siege, were turned into pillars of fire before they could even unload a single bag of grain. The sight of their last hope sinking into the Bosphorus broke the spirit of the Arab land army. They weren't just hungry anymore. They were abandoned. But the most legendary moment of the entire campaign was yet to come. While the sea was burning, a massive Arab relief army was moving overland through the rugged hills of Bithynia, near a place called Saphan. This was a force of thousands, meant to secure the land routes and crush any Roman resistance outside the walls. To stop them, Leo didn't send an army. He sent a scalpel. This is where the legend of the 300 cataphracts was born. In the narrow, wooded passes of the Anatolian hills, the Byzantine heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, waited in total silence. These men were the iron fist of the Roman world. Both horse and rider were encased in scales of steel and iron. They didn't look like men. They looked like statues of polished metal. Their primary weapon was the contis, a massive lance designed to punch through shields, armor, and bone. The Arab relief column was stretched thin, moving through the restricted terrain in a long, vulnerable line. They were tired, overconfident, and completely unaware that they were being watched. Then, the signal was given. The 300 didn't just charge. They accelerated like a freight train made of iron. The sound of 1,200 hooves hitting the hard earth echoed through the valley like thunder. By the time the Arab scouts saw the glint of sunlight on Roman helmets, it was already too late. The cataphracts slammed into the flank of the column with a violence that defies description. The first wave of lances went through the light Arab infantry as if they were made of paper. This wasn't a back-and-forth battle. It was a slaughter. The shock of the impact alone sent hundreds of men tumbling down the hillsides. Because the terrain was so tight, the Arab soldiers couldn't form a line or use their superior numbers. They were trampled under the hooves of the armored stallions or cut down by the long, heavy swords of the riders who followed the initial lance charge. In a matter of hours, a force of thousands was shattered and scattered into the woods by just 300 men. The news of the invincible Iron Riders spread through the Arab camp like a plague, destroying what little morale Maslama had left. Do you believe a small elite force can actually change the course of history? Or is it always about the bigger army? Let us know if you think the story of the 300 is a legend or a tactical reality. But Leo had one more card to play. He knew that the Arabs were still holding their positions, hoping to outlast the city's food supply. To end this once and for all, he called in his heathen allies, the Bulgars. Khan Tervel and his Bulgar hordes were not like the Romans. They didn't care about the rules of civilized warfare. They were steppe warriors who lived for the hunt. When Leo gave the word, the Bulgars descended from the northern mountains like a pack of wolves on a wounded animal. They didn't target the walls. They targeted the Arab camps. The Bulgars used hit-and-run tactics that drove the Arab soldiers to the edge of insanity. They would ride in at dawn, kill hundreds of men in their sleep, and vanish before a counterattack could be organized. The Arab chroniclers themselves admit the horror of this phase. They describe the Bulgars as demons who seemed to enjoy the freezing mud and the gore of the trenches. In one massive engagement, the Bulgars reportedly slaughtered 22,000 Arab soldiers. Maslama Abdul Malik, the man who had come to conquer the world, was now a prisoner in his own camp. He looked at his army, once the finest in the world, and saw walking skeletons. He looked at the sea and saw only Byzantine fire. He looked at the mountains and saw the Bulgar wolves. And every morning when the sun rose, he looked up at the walls of Constantinople and saw Leo III, still standing there, still mocking him, still refusing to die. The golden apple wasn't just out of reach. It had become a poisoned fruit. The greatest invasion in the history of the Caliphate had been systematically dismantled by a man who used lies as well as he used fire. Now there was only one question left. How many men would Maslama be allowed to take home? On August 15, 718, exactly 1 year to the day since the siege began, Maslama gave the order he never thought he would give: retreat. The great host of the Ummayad Caliphate, once 120,000 strong, was now a tattered remnant of broken men. They burned their remaining siege towers and abandoned their heavy equipment, leaving behind a landscape of mud and bone that would scar the earth for generations. To the Romans inside the walls, this was a miracle of divine protection. To the Caliphate, it was a catastrophe without precedent. But the nightmare wasn't over for the survivors. As the remaining Arab fleet tried to sail south through the Sea of Marmara, the Mediterranean itself seemed to rise up to finish what Leo's fire had started. A series of massive superstorms tore through the exhausted fleet. Ships that had survived Greek fire were smashed against the rocks or swallowed by the waves. Volcanic ash from an eruption on the island of Thera reportedly turned the sea into a gray tomb, clogging the oars of the dying vessels. Of the 1,800 ships that had set out to conquer the world, some records claim only 5 made it back to Syria to tell the Caliph what had happened. If Leo III had failed and Constantinople had fallen in 718, do you think the world you live in today would even exist? Would Europe have become an Islamic continent 700 years earlier? Let's hear your alternate history theories in the comments below. The numbers of the aftermath are staggering. Out of a total force of nearly 200,000 men, including the original army and the reinforcements, barely 30,000 crawled back across the borders of the Caliphate. The expansion of Islam into Eastern Europe was halted for 7 centuries. Leo III didn't just save a city. He saved an entire civilization. If he hadn't used his great lie to buy time, or his great fire to break the sea, the bridge between Asia and Europe would have collapsed, and the dark ages of the West might have never seen the light of the Renaissance. Leo would go on to rule for decades, becoming a controversial figure who reshaped the church and the law, but his military genius was never questioned again. He had looked into the eyes of the most powerful empire on earth and refused to blink. He proved that history isn't just made by big battalions. It's made by the man who can endure the cold, tell the best lie, and hold the line when everyone else has already started to run. This is a story of how a single man's deception changed the map of the world. If you want more deep dives into the high-stakes battles that history tried to forget, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. What historical mystery or impossible victory should I cover next? Tell me in comment section. The siege of 717 was over. The golden apple remained out of reach, and as the last Arab sail vanished over the horizon, Leo III stood alone atop the Theodosian walls, watching the sunset over a world that was still, against all odds, Roman.